Hear ancient words of faith from the book of Genesis. The child grew, and on the day of weaning, Sarah and Abraham held a great feast. But Sarah noticed the child that Hagar, the Egyptian, had borne for Abraham, playing with her child Isaac. She demanded of Abraham, "Send Hagar and her child away. I will not have this child of my attendant share in Jacob's inheritance." Abraham was greatly distressed by this because of his son Ishmael. But God said to Abraham, "Don't be distressed about the child or about Hagar. Heed Sarah's demands, for it is through Isaac that descendants will bear your name. As for the child of Hagar, the Egyptian, I will make a great nation of him as well, since he is also your offspring." Early the next morning, Abraham bought bread and a skin of water and gave it to Hagar. Then, placing the child on her back, he sent her away. She wandered off into the desert of Beersheba. When the skin of water was empty, she set the child under a bush and sat down opposite him, about a bow shot away. She said to herself, "Don't let me see the child die." And she began to wail and weep. God heard the child crying, and the angel of God called to Hagar from heaven. "What is wrong, Hagar?" the angel asked. "Do not be afraid, for God has heard the child's cry. Get up, lift up the child, and hold his hand, for I will make of him a great nation." Then God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water. She went to it and filled the skin with water, and she gave the child a drink. God was with the boy as he grew. He lived in the desert and became a fine archer. He made his home in the desert of Paran, and his mother found a wife for him in Egypt. 4 foundational stories of faith. Thanks be to God.
Good morning, all. A contemporary reading, Hagar in the Wilderness, by Tahimba Jess. My God is the living God, God of the impertinent exile, an outcast who carved me into an outcast carve, by sheer and stony will, to wander the desert in search of deliverance. The way a mother haunts for her wayward child. God of each eye fixed to heaven, God of the fallen water jug. Of all the hope a vessel holds before spilling to barren sand. God of flesh hewn from earth and hammered beneath a will. Immaculate with the power to bear life from the lifeless, like a well in a wasteland. I am made in the image of a God that knows flight but stays me. Rock still to tell a story ancient as slavery, old as the first time. Hands clasped together for mercy, and parted to find only their own. Salty blessing of sweat. I have been touched by my God. In my creation, I've known her caress of anointing callous across my face. I know the lyric of her pulse across these lips, and yes, I've kissed the fingertips of my dark and mortal God. She has shown me the truth behind each chiseled blow that's carved me into this life. The weight any woman might bear to stretch her mouth towards her. One true God, her own beaten marble soul. For spiritual challenge and mystery in human struggles. Thanks be to God.
May I speak, and may we all reflect, in the name of God, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. As I've lived most of my church life, primarily in Anglican and ecumenical settings, I have to admit to a little bit of bemusement about the annual marking of the Uniting Church's founding. Now, I guess it's partly the equivalent of the patronal festivals in other mainstream churches. However, they typically centre on a particular saint or an aspect of faith, like the Holy Trinity or All Saints, after which a particular congregation is named, not a particular Christian denomination. Denominationalism is, after all, a very modern idea, and it would be a horror to our Uniting Church Reformation forebears, although there is a Reformation Sunday. Jean Calvin, for example, was seeking to reform the one universal Church of God, not to create an alternative to the Catholic Church. The great Methodist pioneer John Wesley also formed a vital and innovative new movement, but never sought to leave the Church of England. That, I think, is pertinent in marking this anniversary, because it directs us back to the central Uniting Church's crucial and perhaps distinctive ecumenical and open future charisms. They are very clear in the basis of union, the key Uniting Church founding document. That makes clear that as a body, we in the Uniting Church are only one very small part of the universal church through time and space. Therefore, rather than trying to be yet one more denomination, as if we need more religions and churches in this world, we're called to help pioneer new paths of healing faith and relationships. So our calling is always indeed to be a uniting church, holding our structures lightly and open to new ways of being followers of Jesus with others. So how might today's story about Hagar speak to that? Because that story is a powerful challenge, isn't it? It's a story that's both shocking and yet full of liberation. Like Sarah's story we looked at last week, we're invited to wrestle with this text and discover the true living God beneath and beyond it. On the one hand, we encounter a mixture of intersectional oppressions as Hagar experiences misuse of power, racism, sexual abuse, and economic exploitation, interfaith or religious violence, and slavery. In this, she represents all of those who have been othered by the apparent victors of history, who also betray their own best selves and traditions in doing so, even though they have some merit. On the other hand, and this is the most important thing of all, Hagar represents not just survival of such injustices, but represents those who've discovered the true living God amidst those struggles. Indeed, with Hagar, all those survivors of injustice and those who struggle for justice today name that God afresh and therefore call on us all to travel together afresh as one body. Hagar's story helps reveal many of the shadows and the separations of our human histories, not least our religious ones. Today's reading is a continuation of Genesis 16, where Sarah gives Hagar to Abraham in order to produce a child. Resentment then develops between the women, and Hagar runs away. She is, after all, an Egyptian, an African, a foreigner with no rights and no status. Asked to choose between them, Abraham sides with Sarah, leaving Hagar helpless. And these chilling words, "Your slave is in your power," he says to Sarah. "Do to her as you please." But Hagar's not without comfort. Rather, she's given, astonishingly, a similar blessing to Abraham. "I will increase your descendants so much," God says to Hagar, "that they'll be too numerous to count." As with many other biblical patriarchal narratives, we have etymological or origin stories here, which help to explain some of the later differences between peoples. So Hagar and Ishmael's descendants will eventually flourish as a blessed people of God alongside Abraham and Sarah's descendants. It's hard for people to get their heads round, but right there back in the pages of the Bible, we see there is not one people of God, there are two peoples of God at least. So we are challenged to acknowledge how the God of our faith tradition, Abraham and Sarah, is so much more than a God of one tribe, social or religious. Rather, God seeks healing, justice, and reconciliation for all people beyond the shadows and the separations that human beings inflict and consolidate. Hagar's challenges resonate in our own world, don't they? Not least in racism and interreligious violence, as well as sexual oppression and forms of modern slavery. It has also become commonplace to talk of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam as different Abrahamic pathways. That's what that song we just sung was about, written by Ruth Duck. But interreligious flourishing will not happen fully unless we engage with the shadows in all of our traditions, not least the Hagar traditions, which throw up gender, race, and colonialist challenges to us. Race and slavery issues are powerfully present in the continuing use of the Hagar stories. It's very significant and illuminative, isn't it, that Hagar has a very different place in white churches, where she's hardly mentioned. But if you go to black churches, especially African American, she is an iconic figure. And you'll see on the front there, John Shaines from the early 20th century, very strong. Then you see a crescent there. There's a lot of stuff in that as well. John Shane was a Ukrainian by background, part of that. Foreigners coming to America and trying to digest what it means to be an outsider and yet to know God with you. Because Hagar, as an African, as an Egyptian, and a slave, speaks powerfully of liberation to black churches, emerging from a deep, transformative relationship with God. That's the experience of African Americans and others who have wrestled with this story and found in Hagar a symbol of liberation through the grace of God. So black life and theology in America especially, not least womanist theology, is typically full of reflection on Hagar. Indeed, there's a whole set of stories around Auntie Hagar that go beyond the Bible in African American and other cultures. Because whilst white churches and most of the Christian tradition identifies with Sarah and Abraham, in their stories, as we hear today, there is power and abuse, just as there has been in white churches and still is in some, power and abuse being misused, flowing from privileges of race, wealth, and status. So those things need naming so that God's liberation may freely flow for all peoples. Even more importantly, however, we need to name and celebrate the love and power of God that flows through Hagar and people like her. And that's one of the gifts of the black churches and black theologians to us today. Perhaps the most powerfully expressive aspect of Hagar's story is in Genesis 16, verse 13, which comes with this story today. This follows God's promise to address Hagar's affliction. So God makes the first move, as it were, to give her Ishmael and to nurture a great people through them. Hagar's response is to name God. That's quite extraordinary. For Hagar to name God, it's an act taken by an outsider, a woman and a slave. She names God. She understands, she experiences God, and she proclaims this God to others. So if we have ears, let us hear. It is through Hagar, through people like her, out of their experience of God, out of our own experiences of God, that living faith emerges. And new living faith is emerging today through those who've been outsiders, the Hagars of our world. Who then today, we might ask, is similarly speaking to us and naming God afresh to us? The name that Hagar gives God is also significant for all of us, because Hagar calls God in Hebrew El Roi, the God who sees me. The God who sees me. What a wonderful name for God. It has at least two key features. Firstly, as Hagar says, she stayed alive having been seen and seeing God. In other words, God, this ultimate power and mystery, does not destroy us as we share our deepest needs. Rather, God is love, strength, and comfort for us in our deepest need and vulnerability. So we need not be afraid in life, but rather open up our hearts to this power that sees us and loves us just as we are. Secondly, in this, we glimpse how God's redemption works. It is, after all, I don't know your experience, but it's when we are seen, isn't it, by one another and by God, heard and known, that new life comes to us. We know that in our experience. When we feel that others have truly seen or heard us, things change. Hagar witnesses to this, and above all to the reality that even in the wilderness, in the worst places we can be, when the water jugs have fallen out and there is nothing seemingly there for us, when no one else is with us, when no one else sees or hears, never mind cares, God does. God is there in our deepest wildernesses. What a gift to us that Hagar offers us. Even in the most desperate of circumstances, our lives can be transformed by that love and power. Last night I was at another anniversary, the 50th anniversary of acceptance. Sydney, LGBTIQ Catholics. 50 years before this church even got on board with that stuff. 50 years of celebration and affirmation. And also I think it was the 45th anniversary of the first Mardi Gras. And Claude Mostovich spoke, and he finished up by saying, "Know that you are seen, that you are loved. We are seen, we are loved by God, and in that strength we can go forward, however marginalized we have been or still are, like some of the Catholics in the churches, like Hagar or any others." So our contemporary reading, which I've chosen today, is about that seeing and hearing of God, the hearing and seeing of God that can bring us into new life. Entitled Hagar in the Wilderness, it comes from Tahimba Jess's collection Olio, and is but one expression of this long and continuing African-American high valuing of Hagar. This poem explicitly reflects on a sculpture by Edmonia Lewis, and you can find it in your book there, and Tahimba Jess asked us to look at it. Edmonia was an extraordinary Native American and African American pioneer who lived through the abolitionist struggle and the US Civil War, but was forced to flee due to racism to Rome, where she was highly successful. Now, if you look at that sculpture, it's obviously ambivalent, isn't it, to us in the 21st century because of its original context. Because you will see that there's very white features, not just the marble, but very European features. That's because Edmonia Lewis could only really largely produce things for white audiences and find a living by producing those things. So in themselves, they kind of symbolize the sufferings of the subjugated Hagar and women and others like her. But notice that figure is not just a traditional white portrayal of Hagar. The figure is not cast down, nor is she simply portrayed as a mother, which is what usually the white churches and traditions have made of her. Instead, Lewis deliberately left Ishmael out, not because Ishmael wasn't important, we hear that in the story to her, but because in order to focus on Hagar's strength and knowledge and reception of God, emerging out of such trials. So you'll see her hands are clasped there in prayer. And as she is seen and heard into being by God through this deep prayer, she takes a step forward. Can you see her foot there? Which shapes a new future beyond the shadows and separations of suffering. So what we see in this is the discovery of God anew, and in that strength, the beginning of liberation and that of her descendants. And that's why that beautiful poem that the poet reflects on expresses what Edmonia Lewis was trying to say. That my God is the living God. Not of the past, Abraham and Sarah back in the books of Genesis, but the living God that is present amongst us wherever there is injustice and struggle. God of the impertinent exile. Isn't that a wonderful phrase? God of the impertinent exile. That's what we're called to be, impertinent exiles. Called to walk with God through the wilderness into a new place. I've kissed the fingertips of my dark and mortal God. These are very evocative terms. She has shown me the truth behind each chiseled blow that's carved me into this life, as it were, imprisoned me. The weight that any woman might bear to stretch her mouth towards her one true God, her own beaten marble song, and yet it's as if this marble is coming alive and she is stepping out, and out of her European frame too, into the fullness of her life. So see how enfleshed this God is. Amazing. This is not a God beyond, this is a God here amongst us, and in black form too. This is not the patriarchal God, the supposed power over us, who is used by people to command obedience to injustice, for people to stay in their place. But this is the power of eternal love with us to free us, to liberate all oppression. And even if we can only make one little step beyond our marble prison, we can do so. So no wonder Hagar is such a powerful icon for black people. As the Episcopalian priest Wilder Gaffney observes in her book, Womanist Midrash, I read Hagar's story through the prism of the wholesale enslavement of black peoples in the Americas and elsewhere. Hagar is the mother of Harriet Tubman and the women and men who freed themselves from slavery. I see Hagar also as an abused woman. I see God's return of Hagar to her servitude and abuse as the tendency of some religious communities to side with the abuser at the expense of abused people and their children. Frequently, that advice is couched as God's will. But ultimately, Hagar escapes her slaveholders and her abusers and receives her inheritance from God, for God is the God with us, the God that fulfills all of God's promises to her. So to conclude, what, you might ask, is all of this to do with the Uniting Church anniversary? Well, it is appropriate, I think, that the Uniting Church anniversary doesn't just fall close to the original Sydney Mardi Gras, but also close to Juneteenth, the United States national anniversary commemorating the emancipation of slaves. Because if we're to move forward as a church, not just as a Uniting Church, but the whole church, and as a world, we need to remember Hagar and her experience and vision of God as a core biblical example of God's call to an open future with others. So who is Hagar for us today? What are the shadows and the separations, the hard things that have broken us apart with which we live? What steps and shapes do we need to sculpt? And how will we do this with other Christians and others of goodwill? As the basis of union outlines, the Uniting Church does not exist at all except in relation to other churches and other people. And so we must always seek to transcend our limiting human boundaries. To assist with this, the Uniting Church is currently going through a national conversation to which we're all invited to take part, called Act 2, in which we hope that people will reflect and pray and work so that the church can renew itself in this great task. So I hope that after worship this morning, many of us might take up an opportunity that we're offering today, which is why you'll find at the back of the pew sheet a little extract from the basis of union, an opportunity to reflect together on what vision we have for that. To do so, we need to reflect both on our own traditions and our own experiences, but also on those who are in the shadows or separated from us. Because the God of Hagar is the living God of wonderful surprise and new life, and calls us afresh out of whatever wilderness we find ourselves. In the name of Christ, who suffers with us, seeing and hearing us into new steps of new life, and sculpting us into shapes of joy and purpose. Amen.